Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I want to welcome everybody to the SSII webinar on the new unilateralism, arms control and disarmament. We've been watching for well, first let me introduce our very expert panelists. We have Subrata Ghosh Roy, who is an old friend and who is presently research affiliate with the program in Science, Technology and Society at the MIT. We have Dr. Tariq Rauf, who is former alternate head of IAEA NPT delegation in Vienna, and of course has been dealing with arms control and disarmament issues for decades now, and traipses off all over the world, giving his views on the developments as well, and follows them very closely. And we also have Mr. Anwar, who is director of the Conflict Law Center, CLC, at RSIL, which is the Research Society of International Law. And of course, he cooperates with SSII regularly, and we are very beholden to him for teaching international law for the various workshops that we've had. And we always value his views on international law. So, and we have Waqas, of course, who is our Director General now at SSII, and is taking SSII into new directions. We will email people about the new direction and new setup of SSII. And we want to welcome all the other participants as well. Basically, the reason that we thought we'd have this discussion is we are seeing under the Trump administration the sort of regime that was set up on arms control, nuclear arms control and disarmament, basically being destroyed. I don't think it's too strong a word if you see what has been happening. And my own perspective is that it's not happening in isolation. This is something that has been evolving in American politics. We saw, for example, the coalitions of the willing concept, which came in after the invasion of Iraq by the US in 2001, when we had George Bush. And basically, the coalitions of the willing continues to persist. We now have the new idea in the Pacific, which the US, the Quad concept, where it's now, they're trying to rename it as the Indo-Pacific region. And we know that under Mr. Modi, there is an expansionist perspective and the new sort of strategic partnership. So we've seen overall the international security environment also moving more towards a new form of unilateralism, with what I had said many years ago, with core states that are linked to the US, like Israel, you have the UK, you have Poland, and then if you move in, you have India, Australia, Japan. And you are seeing that now emerging in a more concrete shape. And alongside that, of course, you have the arms control, nuclear arms control and disarmament regime also sort of coming under not just stress, but actively being undermined. It began much earlier, in my view, when the US and India signed the nuclear deal, because that was the first violations by the US and then by the UK and France and Japan even of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Articles 1 and 2. So that was, people don't tend to link that up, but I think that was the beginning of the challenges to the existing non-proliferation regime that has come about. And of course, after that, we've seen the Trump administration take things further. We had the US walking out of the JCPOA, which was problematic. And we also had, of course, the fate of SALT and START. We know the INF treaty is also under stress. So what we're seeing basically is that all the multilateral and even the bilateral nuclear agreements and arms control agreements, they're sort of gradually being eroded. And what is of great concern is, of course, that the US is also now intending to carry out nuclear tests. The CTBT, which I find an extremely, Tariq, I hope you'll excuse my critique, that here's a treaty which is not operational, but has a whole CTBTO organization around it. But now if the US decides to start testing again, then there'll be very little left even of the CTBTO, frankly. So this is, and you know, the Senate Armed Services Committee in June this year approved an amendment to the fiscal 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, where they said that they would put in the money for nuclear tests if necessary. So the US certainly is heading that way. And if you see the Russians will also be going that way. China, therefore, is not interested in coming to nuclear talks with the US and Russia. So basically, this entire architecture of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear arms control and disarmament, frankly, is up for grabs. So that's, of course, of great concern to a country like Pakistan, because we in our neighborhood have, Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state, and so is India, a much larger state. It has now its Far Eastern Command in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So if the Trump administration and its allies are moving towards ending decades-long arms control structures that came into place, then what implications does it have for the world at large, and also for our region, where conflict now, there is an underlying element of a brewing conflict that the present Indian regime is quite ready to sort of take on and expand it into an actual conflict with Pakistan. They're testing Pakistan's reactions. There are a whole lot of drones that have been shot down by our military. The Indian drones are military drones that have come into our territory. The Indian military is firing incessantly across the line of control and the working boundary. So there are all these issues that I think, instead of looking at them separately, there's a pattern that is emerging, and we need to discuss this pattern as a whole. So those are views, some thoughts I thought I'd throw out. And I would now hand over to Subrata for his views on how he sees things happening.
Good evening, Shireen. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm honored to share the platform with a person like Tariq Banuri. Shireen, you stole a little bit of my thunder, because the title of the webinar is the new unilateralism. And as you now correctly pointed out, that it is actually not so new, that this has been going on ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, when the United States got a free hand in the world affairs, and it handled it very, very poorly. 2 years ago, when I spoke at another seminar that Shireen had moderated at that time, 2 years ago is October of 2018, and there I pulled out one of my slides titled, which caused a lot of consternation, and that is, I said that the US policies in general, nuclear policies in particular, are squarely to blame for the global disorder in all spheres. And I have no reason to change my title, even though it causes a lot of discomfort in Washington when I say something like that. And I am definitely a toxic person in both in Washington and in New Delhi. So I start with that premise that it's not new, but what is new, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation in the United States about this. So from my vantage point in the United States, as Shireen also has hinted at, is that the disarmament, nuclear disarmament, is not is no longer differentiated from the U.S. foreign policy overall. What I mean by that is this: that even in the height of the Cold War, there was nuclear arms control negotiations that proceeded despite the fact that there was intense battle, sometimes even shooting wars between, if not directly between the superpowers, but proxies and so forth. And so as an example, I would cite the Nixon-Brezhnev negotiations conducted by Kissinger in the background when Nixon was doing saturation bombing in Cambodia, in Hanoi, Haiphong, and so forth. The negotiations continued. There was a channel that was established that remained, and in 1972, they signed this landmark anti-ballistic missile treaty in Moscow between Nixon and Brezhnev. So the benefit of this sort of dual track approach to that, we really have to talk about arms control. We have to have a rule of law in that area. So other parts of the foreign policy may have different situations. And another one was scientific collaboration in the space programs between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, all of that have kind of disappeared. And the other new development from the US, and that is very critical, is that we, of course, are concerned about the situation of these treaties, of the NPT, about a breakdown of the Conference on Disarmament and so forth, of the total politicization of the IAEA and those things. But here is to change some of these things. There must be change in the US political situation, because the pressure from the international community on the US is very small, unfortunately, because they can really get away with anything. And I was on Capitol Hill for several years working on the House International Relations and House Armed Services Committees in the late 90s, early 2000. And my experience was, at that time, it was right after sort of 10 years after the end of the Cold War, and the US was just absolutely supreme in its power and the total debacle in the Soviet Union. So the foreign policy establishment in Washington was just totally drunk with power, and they were often would tell that, look, I mean, people can make noises here, there, but we will prevail. And unfortunately, that thinking has sort of really become permanent. And now there is this new thing, and that is the Cold War liberals who are virulently anti-communist, yet believed that nuclear arms control should happen. There is now this conflation of these Cold War liberals with the neocons of the Pompeo's type in many ways. They are even opposing Trump's haphazard efforts to have a rapprochement with North Korea or Putin's Russia. So and they are leading the charge against any sort of movement, at least in the Korean Peninsula. They have been playing a terrible part. And they are desperate, the Cold War liberals, that is, they're desperate to get the old Cold War nemesis back, because that is their whole framework of analysis. This Washington consensus is containment of Soviet Union, and now by default, containment of course, China, but also of Russia. So in their mind, Putin's Russia is no different, despite the fact that it is a completely capitalist country. It has no ideology whatsoever in terms of spreading some kind of internationalism, etc., that they still think that, or in their mind, it's easy to portray Putin as that old Soviet totalitarian government. And now, of course, there's tremendous attacks on China that are going on in the similar way. And they are joined by the neocons. So now we have a terrible situation when there is really no sort of arms control lobby in Washington that bring to the fore. I mean, there is this small organization like Arms Control Association, etc., that do try to bring this to the fore, but not without much of a success. And I think that Biden probably would be a little bit back to the old ways of doing things. So he will definitely extend the START treaty and will probably change a few things regarding overall discussions with Russia, even though he is extremely anti-Russian, an extreme interventionist, as he has demonstrated in Ukraine and so forth, and as he has pushed Trump even, that he was not enough tough on China. So, but finally, I would make one other comment, and that is that the uncertainty in US social and political situation, as we have been witnessing for the last several months, that some economists are predicting a recession. It's a misnomer. It'll be a depression, and that depression will be even bigger in terms of its impact than the Great Depression of the 1929. So we are in a turning point in the U.S. history, in the U.S. political situation. So many things can change. And I think as arms control people, yesterday, Senate passed the NDA that Shireen mentioned about. And NDA put in $740 billion again in the defense budget, with lots and lots of money for missile defense and so forth. So these people in the Senate, and to some extent, there are a lot of them in the House as well, they are in a different world. There's a total disconnect with the political class and what is going on in the country. And I'm deeply worried about the social cohesion and stability in the US. And that will impact every part of our society, our politics, our economy. So I think there'll be opportunities, but there'll be also very big challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Subrata. But this is interesting that you raised the issue that unless change comes from within the US, it's not the external pressure in itself is not going to really impact changes in the disintegration that we're seeing in the multilateralism, especially in the nuclear arms control, disarmament issue area. Tariq, I'm handing over to you now. Tariq Rauf.
Okay, thank you very much, Shireen. I'm very pleased to take part in this webinar organized by SSII in Islamabad. I'm also very pleased to share the platform with Subrata. I've been reading a lot of his writings on arms control in space, anti-satellite weapons, and so on. I'm also very pleased to see Obes. One of his bright researchers took part in the ISODARCO course in northern Italy in January this year. And of course, I'm very pleased to see Waqas, who's the new Director General of SSII. So I'm very glad that Subrata gave us a very good overview of the current situation in the United States. And I will cast a broader net and then say a little bit about, towards the end, what the US is currently doing with regard to nuclear arms control. And I just wonder whether you can see my PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, we can.
You can. All right. So, you can still see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we look at the current trends, if you remember, towards the end of the Cold War, there was this famous book by Francis Fukuyama that there will be the end of history, the era of great power competition will be over. That never really happened. We had new forces came up, terrorism happened, you had interventions by the US, you had the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So the end of history, as was contemplated by Francis Fukuyama, of a new world which would be peaceful, where some of the old rivalries would not happen, and the United States would reign supreme, a sort of a Pax Americana, never really happened in the way that was envisioned. After that, there was talk about a unipolar moment in history, that the United States was the sole surviving superpower with global reach. Russia was portrayed as a regional power, declining. China was emerging, but it was not yet the focus of the US as a competitor. And generally, the allied countries of Europe under the European Union, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the allies in Asia were very much part of this unipolar moment, supportive of what the US overall view was in terms of what they described as a rules-based order in the international system, but the rules as defined by them, which were different, so to speak, from the UN Charter, which talks about a sort of collective defense. Then we had this great war on terrorism, which, as we know, really was a terrible thing, and we are still paying the price of it globally. Instead of squelching terrorism, we have more terrorism in more parts of the world. The United States finally is tiring of its intervention in Afghanistan and wants to leave, and that also is proving problematic. And once it leaves, it will still leave behind a lot of problems in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere, all fomented by this so-called Great War on Terrorism. Now, the latest view by some is called the Thucydides trap, that there will be a war between a rising power and an established power. And this is based on the old Greek history of Athens and Sparta. And according to this particular theory, it is only a matter of time before there will be a shooting war between the United States and China. And the way in which the US is proceeding, and as was very well described by Subrata, many of the actions by the US at the moment seem to be leading in that direction. It also may be a sort of what's called wag the dog, because a presidential election is coming. The current incumbent is not very popular. He's behind in the polls. A foreign adventure always plays well. We can also argue whether the current international system that was created towards the end of, or at the end of the Second World War is still relevant the way it is structured. In many respects, the Security Council is obsolete and dysfunctional. Many other international organizations also are not functioning well. New countries have emerged, and Shireen mentioned that Pakistan and India have emerged as nuclear armed states. They are not adequately represented in various international fora. And then add to that this new great power rivalry with China. So China is now referred to as a near peer competitor by the US. And under the Trump administration, in the break from the Obama administration, the US is not prepared to accept China as an equal. And the US now has decided that they will compete with and combat China in all aspects, starting from the 5G networks, Huawei, South China Sea, this so-called new imaginary geographic area of Indo-Pacific. And generally, you can see building up a full conflict across the spectrum with China. We also now have the rise of nationalism and tribalism. We can see elements of that in dealing with COVID, where some countries are trying to buy up the entire global supply of masks or personal protective equipment or new drugs that may be successful in treating COVID, or a vaccine if it's ever to be developed. The effort towards nation building in the Middle East is also in tatters. We don't have nation building, rather we have nation destruction, and also leading to nationalism and tribalism, as I just referred to, plus state collapse. And as Shireen mentioned, arms control and disarmament, the structures are being steadily dismantled. At the moment, we only have one nuclear arms control treaty operational between Russia and the United States, which will expire in February next year, unless it is renewed by presidential signature. The Russians have indicated that they are willing to extend new start without conditions. The United States still has not decided. The official position is that they are still considering it. Add to this mix the emergence of novel technologies, artificial intelligence, cyber, hypersonic delivery systems, etc. Here, technology is racing far ahead of policy, and we do not yet have codes of conduct or frameworks within which to limit these new technologies, which are also impacting on nuclear weapons. I already mentioned China, but with regard to Russia, there is a lot of dissatisfaction in the West with Russia's policies towards Georgia, towards Crimea, and there is still a resentment that Russia should not emerge as a great power, that Russia really doesn't have any legitimate interest in what the Russians describe as their near abroad. And here again, we have a strategic cooperation where Russian and American forces are constantly probing each other in the Black Sea, in the Arctic, in the North Pacific, which also creates its own problems of inadvertent conflict. So China also is now extending its reach in the Middle East and in Libya and Syria, which is also not playing well. And here we have another vector of a competition between the West, the US in particular, and Russia. With the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, there is also disunity in the EU itself. Now we see a populist revolt against globalism, and COVID-19 is one of the reasons for this. And then all these regional constructs that I had mentioned, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Middle East, Africa, they're also in a lot of disunity and a lot of conflict. So we have a very volatile global political risk environment, and added to that is the increasing salience of nuclear weapons, and I will talk a little bit about that shortly. So what China has been doing over the past few years is it is responding to the containment or the encirclement as perceived by China, encirclement by the US through India and the Asia Pacific. It's also concerned about its emboldened neighbors who are challenging Chinese claims in the South China Sea, also with regard to access to exclusive economic zones, fishing rights, and so on. And China is now working to bilateral relationships as opposed to treaty-based integration like the European Union or some sort of Asia-Pacific security and economic alliance. So next year, the Chinese Communist Party will celebrate 100 years of its founding. And the Chinese president has said that in 2049, which will be 100 years of the People's Republic of China, it wants China to be a major military power and for China to be a rich country by that time. So these are both goals that the United States is now openly opposing. And you can see the rhetoric of Secretary Pompeo, where they do not talk about the Chinese leadership, they talk about the Chinese Communist Party. So here, China is competing and countering the US because the US is relying on external lines of communication through the oceans. China is developing its internal lines of communication through the Belt and Road Initiative. So in a sense, we hark back to the old theory of the Great Game of Mackinder in controlling the Eurasian heartline. So if we look at the next map, if it shows up, here you can see China working through its internal lines of communication, through the land connections and making a new Silk Road all the way to Europe. Already you have cargoes going by rail and road from China all the way to Europe, and then we have all these other elements of the Belt and Road Initiative, and this, of course, is not playing very well in Washington, which is why you have the pushback, along with India, Australia, Japan, so-called Quad. There's also particular concern when it comes to Pakistan and the China-Pacific Economic Corridor. This is how it is perceived of the dragon leaping across the Himalayas and accessing the Arabian Sea. And now with Iran giving China access to Chabahar as well, this has raised even more concerns in Washington and also in India for pushback and confronting the so-called expansion of China. Then when we look at the India-Pakistan-China relationship, here also we have certain tensions. Since last August, a relationship between India and Pakistan over Kashmir has soured. And it also, in my view, reflects that Pakistan does not have a clearly enunciated strategic defense policy. It doesn't have a strategic foreign policy, and I don't think it has an effective policy planning and forecasting capability. Otherwise, Pakistan would not have been caught completely flat-footed without any options when Prime Minister Modi did his actions in August of last year and integrated Kashmir or Indian occupied Kashmir into the Indian Union. So Pakistan has also been improving its relationship with Russia. It's also buying weapons, which is irking India because Russia is still its traditional arms supplier, even though the Indians would like to draw in the United States into the defense industrial sector, and the United States is willing to assemble and manufacture one of its advanced fighters in India, but that really hasn't happened as yet. I will skip this slide. Now, relationship between India and China is also fraught with recent military action over the line of actual control. This is an old slide, but I wanted to replay it because 6 years later, after 2014, the situation is still the same, with China becoming a little more assertive in the region of Ladakh, creating problems for China. And this is, in my view, China sending a message to India to be careful with regard to its collaboration with the United States in squeezing China. I'm very glad that Subrata mentioned North Korea. I think it is to the credit of President Trump that since his engagement with Kim Jong-un, the North Korea has not tested long-range ballistic missiles. It has not carried out any more nuclear weapon tests. And this has not played well with the likes of John Bolton and others. At the Singapore summit, North Korea offered to put Yongbyon on the table, which is 80% of North Korea's military capabilities, but Pompeo and Bolton vetoed it, and so instead of getting the 80% and moving towards denuclearization, we have nothing. And now, because we are coming to an election, North Korea is off the table, so to speak. So, coming back to the Thucydides trap, in my view, we are now entering a dangerous situation over the next few months. It's sort of very interesting that President Trump himself has now turned against China. One of his senior advisors is the advisor called Navarro, who is one of the most anti-Chinese advisors around Trump. And he thinks that having an anti-China policy will play well in the domestic situation. And now with the closure of the consulates in Chengdu and in Houston, we can see a ramping up of this attention. So coming to arms control very quickly, the United States has now changed the whole landscape. In the past, the US was working on nuclear arms control bilaterally with the Russian Federation, but multilaterally through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review process, where in the review conferences of 95, 2000, 2010, the 5 nuclear weapon states had agreed to undertake various measures, which progressively they have not undertaken. And starting in 2018, the US came and completely changed the landscape and said, we will start with the tabula rasa, a white sheet, whatever we agreed in the past, multilaterally in the NPT context, we no longer support that. And they've proposed this new framework called Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, which includes about 40 countries that are invited. It also includes Pakistan and India, who are only too happy to take part in CEND because they are now sharing the table with the 5 other nuclear weapon states. So CEND now has 3 working groups. The latest meeting was done online last week, and they are chaired by, the working groups are chaired by the allies, whose names you can see on the screen. And so what this has done is it has put the onus on nuclear disarmament by the nuclear weapon states in the NPT context on the non-nuclear weapon states, that they need to create the environment in which the nuclear weapon states can feel safe enough to further reduce their nuclear weapons. So critics like me, we do not refer to this as creating the environment for disarmament. I would argue it's creating the environment to never disarm. And if we look at US nuclear operations, a document released last June, the US clearly now posits using low-yield nuclear weapons to create conditions for restoration of strategic stability. Russia has what's referred to as escalation to de-escalate. That's not the term they use, but basically, again, to resort to early use of low-yield or nuclear weapons to prevail in a conventional conflict in Europe, where they think that they would lose to superior conventional forces of NATO. China, as I mentioned, has this view on its 100th anniversary to have what's called a strong military dream. They have this integrated strategy of military-civilian fusion for full spectrum power projection and to be a global military power on its 100th anniversary, which the United States has said that it will oppose. India, Pakistan, you saw the events of February of last year between India and Pakistan, and the tensions continue, as Shireen mentioned, with across the line of control firing and probing, and so this also is a dangerous situation. So we have this collapsing architecture that Shireen referred to. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty stopped being implemented in August of last year. The Open Skies Treaty, which is a confidence building measure, the US wants to leave that. The New START is up in the air. We don't know whether it will be renewed or not. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is now signed by 82 countries, ratified by 14. It will enter into force when 10 more countries ratify it. There is no sign of a fissile material control treaty, and this would be of interest to Subrata. We have actually no discussions really on having a code of conduct or having arms control or preventing an arms race in outer space. So we now, instead of making new agreements, we are dismantling agreements. However, in June, the United States and Russia engaged, and today, starting yesterday and until tomorrow, the two sides are meeting in Vienna, and they are discussing in 3 bundles: space, military doctrines, transparency, and verification. The United States wants China, so if you look at the picture on the extreme right, last month, the Americans in the meeting room, they put up the Chinese flag, and then they tweeted that China was hiding behind the Great Wall of Secrecy. The Chinese ambassador tweeted back and saying, well, we told you we were not coming, so why did you put up our flags? But at least it's a positive sign that the two sides are continuing these discussions in these 3 baskets. We don't know what the result would be, but hopefully it would lead to a renewal of the START agreement. Now, the dangers of inadvertent and accidental war are increasing. Former Defense Secretary Bill Perry has produced a new book called The Button. Even the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has moved the doomsday clock to 100 seconds, which it has never been that close to midnight before. That is a nuclear catastrophe. The United States is opposed to reaffirming the Reagan-Gorbachev understanding that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And as Subrata mentioned, all the multilateral forum are deadlocked. What was agreed in the NPT review process is also being rolled back. And this is my final slide. We now have a whole bunch of competing multilateral proposals for nuclear disarmament, and there really is no engagement. The different groups are really stuck with their respective points of view, and there is very little prospect of moving this forward when the NPT review conference takes place, if it does, in January next year, postponed from April this year because of COVID. So with that, I would like to thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. That was really interesting, fascinating. It's a pity you don't want the slides up, but anyhow, I love the slides. I'm sure everybody enjoyed them. Now I would like to request Wes Anwar to give us his views. And I'm glad that we're looking at the perspective from an overall picture, connecting the dots that are leading to what is happening in the arms control disarmament, because you can't look at that field separately and in isolation. So Wes, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, SSII, Dr. Mazari, Waqas, for having me. And of course, sharing the panel with Mr. Tariq Rauf and Mr. Ghosh Roy. It's a pleasure to be here. As a lawyer, we're trained to, give our disclaimers before we speak. So first of all, I'm not an expert in arms control and disarmament, but international law is my area, so that is something that I will try to add a bit to the debate from. So when we look at the concept of unilateralism, in the specific context of international law and the international legal order, we need to understand a few things. All government acts are, inherently unilateral acts, and they happen every single day all around the world, and they're usually not problematic. They become problematic when they start, impinging upon the sovereignty of other states or another state, or that they're enforced or applied in territory which the state claims to have as its own, but in fact is disputed territory. We see this all around the world happening, most recently perhaps in our own neighborhood with regards to Kashmir and all of those issues. But unilateral acts, when they become contentious, is really when the concern arises. Because what we have is states imposing their values or imposing certain obligations on other states or limiting the options that those states have. And that is when the issue arises problematically. And the real problem lies in where this type of action, this unilateral action, undermines the international legal order. Now, the international legal order is what gives us stability and predictability and certainty and clarity, which is necessary. And in a domestic context, we look at the concept of the rule of law, and this is just as important in the international context. For international relations to function, for international entities and states to be able to cooperate, that certainty, that predictability is what brings in stability and allows for peaceful international relations. And that is really what's undermined by these acts. Now, both the speakers before me have outlined, the withdrawal, the unilateral withdrawal from certain international instruments and legal mechanisms, especially in the field of arms control and disarmament. And that, again, is another form of unilateralism that is undermining the international legal order. So when we see, the US withdrawal from the JCPO or the INF treaty, not extending the New START, which will expire next year, open skies, all of these issues come about and undermine the international legal order that's established. Now, what we need to understand is these international mechanisms, are not constructed in a vacuum. There's an entire infrastructure that develops to help promote these. Other international states operate, and our, signals are given on how trajectories of international relations are supposed to take place. Those are all then undermined in that context. So what we often see is that unilateralism can also be, in this specific context, can also be seen as an attempt to reconfigure international agreements and mechanisms in light of new emerging realities, such as the rise or the ascension of China. And we see, the US wanting to include China in some of these arms control mechanisms. And it's understandable from that perspective. But the damage that is done to the international legal order through unilateral acts is nonetheless done and significant in that regard. What we also see is, as a response to pure unilateralism, bilateralism emerging, where you have bilateral treaties or a network of bilateral treaties between countries. But there are problems in that mechanism as well, because it creates those cliques or those small groups which undermine the multilateralism and the approach of taking along the world community when it comes to decision making. And so I think our understanding of, especially from an international law perspective, of unilateralism has to be somewhat nuanced. We can see that actions are taken which would ostensibly seem to be in violation of treaties, but when states justify those actions, they justify it through exceptions within the international legal mechanism. That is one type, of unilateralism, if you will. What that does is that although it retains the architecture, the international legal architecture there, it does hollow it out. But there's still some mechanism within which negotiations can take place or a negotiated settlement can arise. The other is these, as Dr. Mazari mentioned, the destruction of the international order or the obliteration through mechanism where you completely withdraw from the overall international legal mechanism. And that is where really the problem arises. Because when you still have a structure in place, it can be renegotiated, it can be brought about, and there's some level of stability, predictability, and understanding that exists. But withdrawals from entire orders, that is where really the problem arises, especially going forward, because the level of uncertainty suddenly escalates. So these are just some of the issues that I wanted to discuss. Just one last point before I, end this, is that what we also may be seeing is with changes in international politics and with power relations and all of that, it could also be going back to unilateralism or taking unilateral action could also be a sign of the panic that arises when you recognize your waning power. And that is something I think that is troubling, because any decision taken in a state of panic or in the death throes, if you will, of your hegemony is going to remain problematic. And that's something that we need to realize, that trying to or attempting to reassert your influence and your power through unilateral action is not something that is going to promote either the international legal order or even the national interests of countries involved here. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. I'm going to now hand over to Waqas, because we have some participants who want to.
Thank you very much, Ji. Khalid Damri Sahab, if you have any questions or comments to add to the current discussion, we'd be happy to hear your views of the topic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing this. I've heard the discussions very, very closely, and I think it's pretty easy for me to say I agree. Lots of things that have been said, and I would not want to kind of echo them again, but there are a few points that one can mention about which kind of need to be reasserted, shall we say. This is a difficult time for arms control, and in the context that we're talking about, the unilateralism itself. We have, of course, talked about that it is the kind of approach that the United States has in particular is hurting the bilateral, it is hurting the multilateral approach, and in the current situation of the pandemic, it is hurting the management as well because of the WHO funding withdrawal, the way it has come. There are several aspects that one has to keep in view while looking at these aspects, that there are new technologies that are being developed, and in all that direction, the emerging technologies are that they are evolving and they will have an impact and onto the issues of arms control. But let's also keep in mind that emerging technologies are not necessarily restricted to the highly industrialized countries only. And some military applications seem to be on the anvil that can also bring in new kind of pressures for arms control. But the environment, the way it is evolving, is significantly malleable in the sense that there's new signaling from the US on nuclear testing, on enhanced funding. There also there's the politics of unilateralism. We have heard many references today to the Pompeo statement and so on and so forth. But I want to actually bring this closer to home by saying that once these trends start to happen and evolve, there are significant attempts in our neighborhood that actually uses this. So Moody's India, the way it is standing today, there's this notion of hyper-nationalism that is prevalent in the whole world, but in particular, what we see in the sense of the point that I would like to make on nuclear arms control is when the Cold War nuclear arms control was being viewed, there were hair trigger alert kind of doctrines like launch on warning. When South Asia went nuclear, India, and then in response Pakistan, the weapons were largely believed to be in some kind of recessed deterrence mode. Moody's India has changed this now, and it has brought hair trigger tendencies to South Asia now. So there are more vulnerabilities that are coming up: canisterization, long-range missiles, submarine-launched weapons, creating issues of command control, and the provocative doctrines give Narendra Modi a fear of losing elections, and we may even break the moratorium on nuclear testing. We might see that coming from India. What is happening in this situation is that Pakistan is in the security dilemma. The developments that happen in the sense of this management, it has to be, there are things which will have to be factored into the threat perception. Let me make one point. When we heard about the Cold War model, lots of times the Americans and the Europeans will say that it was so hard to get the Soviets onto the table. And you guys actually are talking and you're getting to the table. Not anymore. Even Pakistan, which has been keeping the door to the table open, clearly has CBM fatigue, and there's not interest because India is simply not interested. If nuclear weapon states with close common borders and close proximity do not talk to each other, the thresholds start to get affected. So that's another area to think about. But then in a more global sense, the treaty law is under stress. And treaty law continuously being under stress, both at the US and Russian Federation bilateral level as well as in the multilateral level. Norms is what all we have, but that's clearly not enough. Treaty law being in decline, norm building is a useful tool, but being selective about norm building tends to negate this principle. And there's so many examples have been given by experts with whom I'm very honored to share my comments. Now, one last thing that I would want to say is that nuclear and the new technologies that are evolving, before any regulatory norms are brought in, so there will be a tendency by several states who can to want a piece of the pie on the new technologies before international law aims to regulate it. And if there appears to be an interest not to go, especially the space law, for example, not to go in that direction by several countries so that they can continue to evolve their expertise. Closer to home, we of course know about the Indian ASAT test, which is conveniently ignored in the discussions. So let me stop here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. Always a pleasure to hear your views. I have a question actually for Subrata and one for Tariq. Subrata, the point that Khalid bin Nouri raised about the impact of what Trump and the US are doing at the global level and what Modi is doing within our region, that are we now basically moving away from the whole concept of strategic dialogues? Because India has shown absolutely no interest despite various proposals that Pakistan has put forward. And the US, of course, while it wants to have a dialogue with the Soviet Union, but it has now effectively declared a Cold War against China. So it seems as if the US is not particularly interested in having a dialogue with their with states that they may have problems with. So there seems to be this alignment of perspectives at our regional level with what the US is doing at the global level, or am I reading too much into it? And Tariq, after that, if I can just throw out a question to you, does this mean finally that the CD and its dealings with FMCT, PAROS, everything, they're dead for now, so we may as well not waste much time on them? So Subrata, perhaps you could answer first and then.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I mean, international leadership in every sort of the way, every matter is missing. I mean, of course, by default, US is the international leader because of its power, its military, economic, and diplomatic. So that's totally missing. And what it is creating, as you had pointed out, a big vacuum. So there is, of course, alignment, realignment that are constantly going on in terms of power relations, and the impact of a lack of a strategic dialogue in the coming from the United States in all spheres is certainly a factor that people like Narendra Modi, who are trying to align themselves so closely with Trump and playing this sort of big macho power game, are not are following the example of the master, so to speak. But there is one issue, and that is in the case of South Asia, that I am often told whenever I bring up the India-Pakistan situation with people in India, they will say, well, we're not so worried about Pakistan. We are really worried about China. And that's the verbal, the rhetoric that so, and I speaking to some colleagues in China, and they're saying they're not worried about India. They're worried about the big Satan. And so I think, at least in a regional sense, China, Pakistan, India, that we really need a trilateral mechanism somehow to bring to the, at least from discussion purposes, about security setups in this region, because it is very difficult to sort out things bilaterally between India, Pakistan, given the global situation. Of course, as I said, China is worried about the United States, so its calculations are that. And I just realized now that it's going to be even more intense, that the US is going to be moving in after they have left the INF Treaty, lots of intermediate range missiles to encircle China even more. So it's going to be a lot more intense now in that regard. So, but absolutely, I mean, when I went to Pakistan that was last time, I think it was 2000, maybe 7, I forget now, maybe a little bit later, 2012, that and we were talking with people like Tariq Banuri, and Khalid Banuri, and we were talking about this confidence building measures that were going on as part of the composite Pakistan-India dialogue. But I think all of them have evaporated. And I certainly put a lot of responsibility on India being the bigger player, more powerful, more people, a big economy and so forth, that they have to take the necessary steps. And of course, this unilateral annexation of Kashmir has not done any good to this relationship. So yeah, I mean, I think overall, I don't see any silver line yet, unless things change in the US.
Tariq?
Yes, so I'll come back on a couple of points. Kofi Annan, before he left the office as Secretary General of the United Nations, bemoaned what he called the rusting of the multilateral nuclear arms control and disarmament machinery, where the Conference on Disarmament, the First Committee, all these forums were all deadlocked and no negotiations were carrying on. And now we are sort of 20 years on from that. So it means that we have lost entire generations of diplomats who have negotiating skills, who have experience in negotiating a treaty. And this is very obviously felt when we go into forums now, where people are basically reading prepared statements. They are unable to think broadly. And then this is a controversial statement, but in my view, because of social media, to some extent, the world is becoming stupider by every tweet. If people don't see anything on the web or they don't read a tweet, it never happened. So people have lost their sense of history, of what things happened in the past. What were the foundations on the basis of which the current arms control structure was built? So Khalid Banuri referred to some points, and one of these is the fallacy of technological advantage. When the United States first had the capability to put multiple re-entry vehicles on ballistic missiles, Kissinger was warned by some that, unless we negotiate with this, the Russians or the Soviets will catch up, and then we will be at a disadvantage. But he didn't listen to them. The Russians did catch up. They made the SS-18 missile that had a throw weight capability that could carry up to 30 warheads. They sort of armed it with less. And then the US wanted to come back to single warhead ballistic missiles. So now we have the same issue with regard to, Shane, you need to mute your microphone. So now we have the same issue with regard to space weapons, hypersonic weapons, but here the gap is not very great between China, Russia, and the United States. And the United States has openly accused China of stealing all 15 designs of current warheads in the US arsenal. They've accused China of stealing the design of the F-35 fifth generation fighter, and actually the Chinese version was in the air before the US. So these are the reasons which are driving the US to oppose China at every level because of what they claim is intellectual property theft, not abiding by the rules of the international system. And this has led to this more unilateralism, so to speak, and to have a US-led system. And many of the allies now are also complaining that Trump is moving away from NATO, the established alliances of after the Second World War, and they really don't know how to deal with this. Finally, arms control is not a reward to the adversary. Arms control is an integral part of defense and security strategy. It is to get threat reductions, to reduce the threat posed by the adversary, to bring in some transparency and some discussion with the adversary so you know what is happening and to avoid surprises. But we are recessing to the thinking that arms control is a reward. Sitting down and negotiating on arms control issues is rewarding the adversary for good behavior or bad behavior, as the case might be. Bringing China into the arms control dialogue, actually it was the Russians who first made this point when Obama wanted to go down from the 1,550 warheads of New START to 1,000 warheads. The Russians said, no, now we need to bring in not only China, but also the UK and France. Then the Russians backed off, and now the Americans want the Chinese back. And the Russian response is, well, if that's the case, then we want all five at the table. There was a question on the screen that the United States is building up its defense arrangements with India that potentially could lead to deployment of US forces in India or in the region. If that happens, then I think that will provoke an armed conflict with China. It will also create a very difficult situation for Pakistan. We don't know what the situation will be regarding Iran and its neighbors, because that's also a hotbed of instability that is brewing with the cancellation of the JCPOA by the US and Iran, once again building up its uranium enrichment capability. And now you see all these acts of sabotage in Iran, where they're unable to protect their own nuclear facilities from internal threats. So we are coming into a region of, not a region, but a time of intense instability in this region. And how Pakistan deals with this is an open question. I am not very confident the way in which the Pakistani structure is set up to deal with these issues, because, as I said, nobody knows what the Pakistani defense policy is, what the security strategy is. If there is one, it's very deeply hidden, and parliamentarians like you, Shireen, should be discussing this in Parliament or in closed committees of Parliament, so you bring in different views and have a better structured policy to deal with these new challenges that are coming on the horizon.
Tariq, I
Yes. So, Mr. Ghosh Roy, we have a question from one of our attendees. What are your thoughts regarding the US unilateral approach potentially giving impetus and encouragement to India's designs and brinksmanship in the South Asian region?
Well, I sort of gave the answer to Shireen's question about that. I mean, of course, there is a lot of concern in terms of that we are in a state, in a post-Cold War state, when several countries like China, they don't believe in alliances, and yet we are seeing this kind of a uh, alliance mentality, and in practice also. So this particular emphasis on this newfangled term in the Indo-Pacific region, with money for that purpose. It was in the budget yesterday in the Senate, adding more money for Indo-Pacific missile defense and things of that sort. That it will only raise further tension, and as Tariq very correctly pointed out, that it is very worrisome that if there is an expressed link between the United States and India in terms of military relationship that is aimed at China, I think that's going to be a very, very dangerous situation. And we have nuclear weapons in 3 countries in the region. That oftentimes the consensus in Washington, way back when Clinton was president and I was on the Hill, talking about South Asia being the most dangerous place on earth. In 2000, I wrote an article for the Arms Control Today that it is not, because I had a deep belief in the region and its people, and that we are going to be no more irresponsible than the purveyors of violence everywhere in the world, and the usage of nuclear weapons and so forth. That South Asia is not going to be doing things like that. But things are different in terms of that kind of thinking. And Tariq pointed out also that this whole business of linking nuclear weapons policies and so forth to election prospects of leaders, United States and India and so forth, I think is very, very dangerous.
We have another question. This is from another panelist. I'll repeat the question. Where India is being given membership for export control cartels, Pakistan is continuously expected to do more. What more could Pakistan do to be mainstreamed in the current international order? This question is from Mr. Tariq Rauf. If you would like to address it, please.
While Pakistan was focusing on countering India's application for membership in the India very cleverly got membership in the Missile Technology Control Regime, and also the Australia group. One deals with chemical weapons, and the Missile Technology Regime, as you know, would deal with missiles. In my discussions, unfortunately, many participating governments of the nuclear supplies group are willing to close their eyes and to bring India in, but they are not prepared to do the same for Pakistan. To its credit, Pakistan has been very active over the past 3 years in presenting its case in the margins of the meetings of the nuclear supplies group, and also directly to the participating governments as well as to the chairs of the nuclear supplies group, and to an extent that many of these governments now say that they are tired of Pakistan's representations. And so they are now assuring Pakistan to their face, I'm told, that don't worry, if we bring in India, we will also bring in you. But then behind their back, many of them say, India, we are prepared to accept, Pakistan never, and there are a variety of reasons. Some have to deal with the religion of Pakistan, some have to deal with the particular scientist who was involved in providing nuclear items years ago to certain countries. And also there is more money to be made. This was one of my slides that I showed about Pakistan wanting to buy weapons from Russia, and the Indian Prime Minister of the time, Manmohan Singh, saying, well, you know, the Pakistanis don't have any money. And you can see only China is willing to sell plants to Pakistan. Nobody else is, because they know Pakistan doesn't have the finances. India does. So money talks. And unfortunately, traditionally, arms control has always played a second fiddle to commercial interests going back decades. So this is not something new. On the screen, very quickly, there was a question from Humar Rahman about the NPT review conference. Nobody expects the NPT review conference, whenever it takes place next year or later, to come to any agreement, given the differences between the Russians, the Chinese, and on the one hand, and the United States on the other. In the previous preparatory committee meetings, the Russians and Americans have been fighting openly. The Russians have been complaining that they do not get visas to get to the UN in New York on time. So I have been proposing to move the review conference of the NPT to 2022 to hold it in Vienna, where we don't have such problems. But unfortunately, many diplomats want to go to New York. Why? Because I can buy an iPhone cheaper in New York. So if this is the thinking of diplomats, then you know where their priorities are.
Thank you.
Yes, we have.
Very little time, so there are lots of questions. Maybe we can.
There's one more question which was particularly interest to me. It was also raised by Anam Khan. I'll put up the question again. Isn't there a need to address the US, China, India, Pakistan quadrangle rather than China, India, Pakistan trilemma in arms control? This is for both Mr. Ghosh Roy and for Mr. Tariq Rauf. So if you could kindly share your opinion on the matter.
Mr. Batra, would you like to go first?
Okay, I mean, it's in terms of this quadrilateral versus trilateral. I think that any discussion that involves China, India, Pakistan, I think would be welcome. And the United States, of course, wants to bring China into the previous bilateral discussions with the Soviet Union and Russia. And it certainly doesn't make sense with the number of Chinese missiles, the warheads that are in stock versus what the current inventory in Russia and the United States. So I think the Chinese have a legitimate reason that not to participate in such a trilateral until they feel they're in the same league. And of course, so it may provide the US and maybe to some extent Russians, I don't know, kind of the excuse not to engage in further reductions and discussions because of this situation. But so I don't know the feasibility of such a quadrilateral, but if it doesn't discuss the bilateral or trilateral Russia, China, United States issues, the United States would be in a good position to facilitate a regional dialogue. But I don't see from the US policies of the current regime or any of the previous regimes that that's in the card. I mean, they are certainly not really interested in getting peace in Asia.
Tariq,
So
quickly.
From my point of view, China has officially stated that it will not sit down and talk with the United States on nuclear issues until and unless the United States comes down to its level of 300 or 400 nuclear warheads. In my view, also, China does not want to sit down with India on nuclear issues and treat it as an equal. And then India doesn't want to do it to Pakistan, so we have these disequilibria with regard to these countries. Finally, I don't think the United States will test. Even the $10 million sequestered by Congress is not enough, even though at the Nevada test site there are labeled shafts, but it takes many months to cable the shaft and so on. Unless the US were to do an atmospheric nuclear test, I do not think in the next couple of years the US would be in a position technologically to carry out a nuclear test.
Well, that's some reassurance that the ability might restrict their testing, but you never know. Trump so,
Shireen, I just have one comment on the testing, if I may.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Okay. Well, on the question of testing, I was on the Armed Services Committee at that time. I'm sorry, International Relations, when the CTBT was negotiated and signed, etc. So one of the critical issues at that time was this business of subcritical tests. That is, you can test the weapon, but without creating a chain reaction in the subcritical test. So I think that this mechanism that we are going to, and the US downplayed on it because of, at that time, India raised a big sort of noise about the subcritical test and also the ability of the United States with its computing facilities to simulate tests. So putting in money explicitly for testing, I think is, first of all, it is testing the waters, that what kind of opposition they're going to face in Congress and outside and internationally, that this may start dusting off this whole business that Tariq correctly pointed out. It will need a lot more money than what they have put in, but it is sort of, again, the seed corn to build up to a future potential test. And I just hope we can reverse that in Congress.
We have some concluding remarks very briefly.
Yes, I just wanted to, very briefly discuss, question raised by Khalid Binouri Saab on emerging technologies. And, I don't think we give enough weightage to the fact that the law is always playing catch up. And it's very few instances where, the law is developed before the technology is developed. Maybe perhaps in, blinding lasers and the legal regime regarding that. Technologies in the future are not, limited by countries that have the resources. Some of these are cheaply developed and can be devastating in their impact. And I think really what will need to be seen is how the international community comes along when there's an impetus or a motivation to regulate these technologies, and how we're going to go about doing that. What is the least common denominator, which really is the the basis of international law in these areas? How is that going to be? How is that going to arise? And where's the motivation for that? So I just wanted to, briefly raise that we do sometimes limit these discussions to the nuclear realm, strategic weapons and stuff. But I think it's important to realize that the role that emerging technologies is going to play in this factor, in this realm, but also the wider realm.
Thank you, Wes. Khalid, do you want to add anything in conclusion?
Yes, thank you very much. Just a couple of points very, very quickly. One is on this issue of the nuclear suppliers group. I've always argued that while the path to it is technical, the decision making will always be political. We understand that. But over years, I have seen significant acknowledgement of the technical path that Pakistan has and the credentials that we have, including the energy troikas of different times, including the United States being part of that troika. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other is, Shireen, if you allow me, just an acknowledgement. I have this book in front of me, which is titled South Asia at a Crossroads, Conflict or Cooperation in the Age of Nuclear Weapons, Missile Defense and Space Rivalries. Very ably co-edited by Subrata in the year 2008. And if you look at this question today, it's valid and perhaps more intense today. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid.
I want to thank all our participants. It's been a pleasure. And Subrata, I hope we see you again soon. Let's not keep such big distances and gaps to continue the dialogue. Thank you, Tariq. We're missing your presence here. We're used to having you come frequently, so we're hoping you can come here too. And some issues that clearly have arisen is one, that yes, there is a move towards unilateralism across the strategic environment, not just in the field of arms control and disarmament, but that of course becomes a security concern for the world at large, and especially in our region. I tend to agree with Tariq that Pakistan has made a lot of progress in nuclear safety and controls, in observing international norms. But if you are going to keep everything in the dark, under layers, and you are not going to allow your discussions publicly with facts and data, if you're not going to allow civilians into the discussion about policies, strategic directions, then that creates a lot of unnecessary issues which we don't need. So I think the time has come for Pakistan, frankly, to open up the strategic dialogue and to open up and to the world, because we should have the confidence. We have nothing to hide, as it were, in terms of our nuclear security and safety, in terms of international observance of international norms. Unlike our neighbor, I think we should have that confidence, and we should trust our people to be able to carry the message effectively, because a civilian academic or a civilian representative of the parliament carries a lot more weightage abroad in international forums than do people who don't have, than sometimes people in uniform. So I think that we should take the case of the NSG forward, but I think we should be able to put our case through our parliamentarians who represent the people, through our academics and our civilians who worked in this field. But anyhow, I think we've got a lot more issues that have been raised in this webinar for future webinars and discussions. So I want to thank you, Tariq. I want to thank you, Subrata, Uwais, Khalid, and of course, Waqas for arranging it all. He is now, you'll soon see the new directions the SSII is now going to be going in. We are expanding our mandate. We are also going into not just research, but perhaps teaching as well. And of course, we are totally going to change our structure from the 1st of August. So thank you everyone for joining in. Keep supporting us and keep in touch. And we hope to continue with more of these discussions. And as soon as the COVID restrictions are over, perhaps the discussions can happen with all of us being present physically in Islam.